Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Edward Edinger, the devoted systematizer of the sacred inner life. Together and apart, they mapped the architecture of meaning itself, one seeing symbols as living messengers from depths beyond comprehension, the other discovering how to build bridges between the conscious self and the divine center. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the relationship between ego and self. One, seeing a numinous mystery that could never be fully articulated, the other discovering precise developmental pathways through which consciousness learns to serve something greater than itself. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most, the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Edinger as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the summer of 1956, in the quiet hills above Lake Zurich, an aging Carl Jung sat in his tower at Bollingen, carving stone and contemplating the strange trajectory his life's work had taken. He was 81 years old then, and though his body grew frail, his mind remained sharp as the chisel in his weathered hands. Around him lay decades of accumulated thought, shelves of red leather books filled with his own handwriting, mandalas painted during periods of intense inner work, stones inscribed with symbols whose meanings shifted like water beneath moonlight. Jung had spent more than 40 years trying to articulate something that resisted articulation. The relationship between the small, conscious ego and the vast, unknowable center of the psyche that he had come to call the self. It was an impossible task, really, this attempt to speak about the unspeakable. How do you describe the experience of touching something infinite within yourself? How do you translate visions and dreams and synchronicities into language that won't flatten their numinous quality into mere theory? Jung had tried, with varying success, through thousands of pages of dense prose, through diagrams and amplifications, through his study of alchemy and Gnosticism and Eastern philosophy. He had tried to show rather than tell, to invite his readers into experiences rather than hand them conclusions. But even he knew that much of his work remained cryptic, paradoxical, frustrating to those who wanted clear answers. The medical and psychiatric establishments had largely dismissed him as a mystic. The psychoanalytic community had long ago excommunicated him for his heretical departure from Freud's materialism. Academic psychology regarded his methods as unscientific, his concepts as untestable. Even many who were drawn to his ideas found themselves lost in the labyrinthine complexity of his thought, unable to grasp how it all fit together, unable to find a clear path from the problems of everyday neurosis to the transpersonal experiences Jung described. Jung himself seemed unconcerned with making his work more accessible. If anything, he grew more elusive with age, more willing to speak in riddles and paradoxes, more comfortable with ambiguity. He had seen what he had seen, experienced what he had experienced, and if others couldn't follow, well, that was the nature of the journey. The psyche reveals itself to each person in its own way, in its own time. There are no shortcuts through the unconscious, no maps that work for everyone. But what Jung perhaps did not fully appreciate, sitting there in his stone tower in 1956, was that his work had already begun to find its translators, its interpreters, its devoted students who would spend their lives making the cryptic accessible, the paradoxical comprehensible. One of these was a young American psychiatrist named Edward Edinger, who at that very moment was completing his psychiatric training and beginning his own encounter with Jung's ideas. Edinger would become, in many ways, the great systematizer of Jungian psychology, the one who would take Jung's sprawling, organic, deliberately unsystematic body of work and organize it into teachable structures, into developmental stages, into frameworks that could be applied and understood. Edward Edinger was born on September 20th, 1922, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, into a world very different from the one that had shaped Jung, where Jung had grown up surrounded by the ghosts of European culture, medieval cathedrals, ancient myths, the dying remnants of Christian certainty. Edinger came of age in the American Midwest during the Great Depression. It was a landscape of pragmatism, of making do, of hard-won survival. There was little room for mysticism in Depression-era Iowa, little patience for the ineffable. You worked, you persevered, you built something tangible. Yet even in this environment, young Edward showed signs of an inward orientation, a contemplative nature that set him apart. He was drawn to questions of meaning and purpose from an early age. Where did human beings fit in the grand scheme of things? What was the point of existence? Why did life contain so much suffering? These were not the typical preoccupations of a boy growing up in the Midwest in the 1930s, but they were Edinger's constant companions. He studied medicine at Yale, graduating in 1945, just as the Second World War was ending. The war had shattered whatever remained of Western culture's confidence in its own rational progress. The Holocaust, the atomic bomb, the industrial scale of mechanized death, these horrors demanded explanation. How could the most educated, cultured, scientifically advanced nations on Earth have produced such evil? Freud's theories of repressed sexuality seemed inadequate to account for it. Behaviorism's reduction of human beings to stimulus-response machines felt not just insufficient but obscene in the face of such darkness. It was during his psychiatric residency in the late 1940s that Edinger first encountered Jung's work. The experience was, for him, nothing short of a revelation. Here was someone who took the problem of evil seriously, who understood that the human psyche contained not just a personal unconscious, but depths that connected to something collective, archetypal, transpersonal. Jung spoke of the shadow, the dark side of personality, that must be integrated rather than simply repressed. He spoke of archetypes, primordial patterns of experience that shaped human consciousness across cultures and throughout history. He spoke of the self, a center and circumference of the psyche that was both within and beyond the individual ego. For Edinger, this was the framework he had been seeking, but he immediately saw what Jung himself seemed reluctant to acknowledge, that the framework was too complex, too scattered across hundreds of essays and books, too paradoxical and self-contradictory to be easily grasped. If Jung's ideas were to be useful, truly useful, to suffering people seeking meaning in a shattered world, they would need to be organized, clarified, systematized. This became Edinger's life work. He entered Jungian analysis himself in the early 1950s. first with Esther Harding and later with other first-generation Jungian analysts who had trained directly with Jung in Zurich. He traveled to Switzerland and attended Jung's seminars. He absorbed everything he could of the master's teachings. But even as he did so, his mind was working to organize what he learned, to see the patterns beneath Jung's sprawling explorations, to identify the core structures that could be taught and applied. By the early 1960s, Edinger had established himself as a Jungian analyst in Los Angeles and had begun to develop what would become his central contribution to Jungian psychology, the concept of the ego-self axis. Jung had certainly written about the relationship between ego and self, but he had done so in fragments, in asides, in passages scattered throughout his collected works. He had never systematically articulated how this relationship developed, what stages it moved through, what it looked like when healthy versus pathological. Edinger saw this as the organizing principle that could make sense of all of Jung's psychology. Everything neurosis, individuation, psychological development, the search for meaning could be understood in terms of the ego's relationship to the self. When that relationship was strong and conscious, the individual experienced life as meaningful, as connected to something greater than mere personal concerns. When the relationship was broken or unconscious, the result was alienation, neurosis, a sense of existential emptiness. The ego, self-axis, as Edinger conceived it, was both a structure and a process. Structurally, it was the connection between the center of consciousness, the ego, and the center of the total psyche, the self. Processually, it was the means by which consciousness developed and individuated. The axis could be strong or weak, conscious or unconscious, balanced or distorted. Most psychological problems, Edinger argued, resulted from a disturbance in this axis. What Edinger did, in essence, was take Jung's mystical vision and give it bones, give it structure, give it a developmental framework that could be taught and clinically applied. Where Jung spoke in images and paradoxes, Edinger spoke in stages and principles. Where Jung deliberately avoided systematic presentation, Edinger systematized. Where Jung reveled in the mystery and ineffability of the self, Edinger mapped its relationship to ego consciousness with precision. This was not a betrayal of Jung, but rather a translation, a making explicit of what had been implicit. It was the work of a devoted student who loved his teacher's vision enough to make it accessible to others. But as with all translations, something was inevitably lost even as something was gained. To understand what was lost and gained, we must first immerse ourselves more deeply in Jung's own understanding of the ego, self-relationship as it evolved throughout his life. The concept of the self came to Jung gradually, emerging from his own inner experiences during what he called his confrontation with the unconscious in the years following his break with Freud. That confrontation began in earnest in 1913, when Jung was 38 years old. The split with Freud had been painful, disorienting. Jung had lost not just a mentor and friend, but the entire psychoanalytic community that had been his professional home. He was isolated, uncertain, and increasingly troubled by strange dreams and visions that seemed to press upon him from within. Rather than resist these inner experiences, Jung made a fateful decision. He would give himself over to them, explore them deliberately, see where they led. What followed was a period of intense inner turmoil that lasted several years. Jung experienced visions of catastrophe, of blood flowing across Europe, visions that seemed to presage the outbreak of World War I. He had encounters with inner figures who seemed autonomous, who spoke to him with voices not his own. He engaged in what he called active imagination, deliberately entering altered states of consciousness and dialoguing with these inner presences. One of these figures called himself Philemon, an old man with the wings of a kingfisher and the horns of a bull. Philemon became Jung's inner guide, teaching him that thoughts and images could have a life of their own, that the psyche contained layers and entities beyond the ego's control or creation. In his conversations with Philemon, Jung began to understand that what he had taken to be his own thoughts were actually autonomous contents arising from somewhere deeper, somewhere other. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Jung sometimes felt he was going mad, that he was losing his grip on reality. But he also felt that he was discovering something profoundly important, something that all the theories of psychiatry and psychoanalysis had missed, that the psyche is not reducible to personal history or instinctual drives, that it contains depths that connect to something trans-individual, something archetypal. During this period, Jung also experienced states of consciousness in which his sense of personal identity seemed to dissolve into something vaster. He would feel himself expanding beyond the boundaries of his individual ego, merging with something that felt simultaneously like the center and the totality of existence. These experiences were numinous, sacred, overwhelming. They carried a sense of absolute reality that made ordinary waking consciousness seem pale and derivative by comparison. It was from these experiences that Jung's concept of the self gradually emerged. The self was the name he gave to that vast, transpersonal center he had touched. It was not the ego, not the conscious I that we take ourselves to be in daily life. Rather, it was the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together, and simultaneously the ordering principle that organized that totality. The self was both circumference and center, both the whole of the psyche and the archetype of wholeness. Jung struggled to describe the self adequately. It was, he said, the archetype of archetypes, the God image within the psyche. It was the source of dreams and symbols, the intelligence that guided the process of individuation. It was experienced in moments of synchronicity, when the boundary between inner and outer seemed to dissolve. It manifested in symbols of wholeness, mandalas, quaternity structures, images of the divine child, the mystic marriage. But the self was also dangerous. To identify the ego with the self, to believe that I am God, rather than there is a God image within me, was psychotic inflation, the most dangerous form of psychological pathology. The ego must maintain its distinction from the self, even as it learns to relate to it consciously. The relationship between ego and self was, Jung insisted, one of both connection and separation, both identity and difference. This paradoxical formulation was typical of Jung's way of thinking. He resisted reducing complex psychological realities to simple formulas. The relationship between ego and self could not be captured in a diagram or explained in straightforward language because it was ultimately a mystery, an experience that transcended rational comprehension. You could point toward it, evoke it, amplify it through symbols and analogies, but you could never fully explain it. Moreover, Jung's understanding of the ego, self-relationship, was never static. It evolved throughout his long career, taking on different emphases in different periods. In his middle years, in the 1920s and 30s, Jung was particularly interested in the alchemical symbolism of transformation. He saw in the old alchemical texts a disguised psychology, a symbolic description of the individuation process by which the ego learns to relate consciously to the self. The alchemist's quest to transform base metal into gold was really, Jung argued, the psyche's drive toward wholeness, toward integrating conscious and unconscious into a unified totality. Later, in his final decades, Jung became increasingly interested in synchronicity and the unus mundus, the one world that mystics spoke of, in which psyche and matter were not separate, but different aspects of a single underlying reality. The self, in this formulation, was not just a psychological entity, but something ontological, something that existed at a level deeper than the distinction between inner and outer, subject and object. Throughout all these developments, Jung maintained a certain reticence, a reluctance to speak too definitively about the ultimate nature of the self. He knew that religious language and psychological language were approaching the same mystery from different directions. The self and God might be different names for the same reality, or they might not be, Jung felt he couldn't say for certain. What he could say was that the self functioned psychologically as a God image, and that one's relationship to this inner divine center was the most important factor in psychological health and meaning. This, then, was the Jung that Edward Edinger encountered in the 1950s and 60s, a Jung who spoke in paradoxes and mysteries, who amplified symbols endlessly without always explaining what he meant, who deliberately avoided creating a systematic psychology because he felt the psyche itself resisted such systematization. Edinger revered this Jung, studied him deeply, but also recognized that most people needed something more structured, more accessible. The question was how to systematize Jung's insights without betraying their essential nature. How do you organize the ineffable? How do you teach the paradoxical? How do you create a framework for something that Jung insisted could not be framed? Edinger's answer was to focus on development and on the practical, clinical dimensions of Jung's ideas, rather than getting lost in the mystical and philosophical aspects of the self. Edinger asked, what does the ego-self relationship look like at different stages of life? How does it develop from infancy through adulthood? What goes wrong when psychological problems arise? And how can the therapist help repair and strengthen the ego-self axis? In his groundbreaking 1972 book, Ego and Archetype, Edinger laid out his systematic vision. He began with infancy, describing what he called the state of original wholeness, or inflation, in which the infant ego is still merged with the self. At this stage, there is no clear distinction between subject and object, self and world, ego and unconscious. The baby experiences itself as the center of the universe, omnipotent and unlimited. This is not pathological but natural and necessary, a state of original unity from which consciousness must eventually differentiate. As the child develops, a painful but necessary process of ego, self-separation begins. The ego gradually distinguishes itself from the unconscious, recognizes that it is not omnipotent, accepts the limitations of individual existence. This process, which Edinger called alienation, is analogous to the biblical fall from paradise. The ego falls out of the garden of original wholeness into the world of separation, conflict, and suffering. But this alienation, though painful, is necessary for the development of consciousness. Only by separating from the self can the ego become strong enough to eventually return to conscious relationship with it. The fall is not a mistake, but a necessary stage in development. In healthy development, according to Edinger, the ego maintains a connection to the self even through the process of separation. This connection is what he called the ego-self axis, an unconscious or semi-conscious line of communication through which the self guides the ego's development, sending dreams, symptoms, and intuitions that nudge consciousness toward greater wholeness. When this axis is strong and functioning, the individual experiences life as meaningful. There is a sense of being connected to something greater than oneself, a feeling that one's personal life participates in a larger pattern or purpose. This doesn't mean life is without suffering or difficulty, but the suffering feels meaningful, feels like part of a larger journey rather than mere random chaos. When the ego-self axis is weak or broken, however, the result is what Edinger called ego-self alienation. The individual feels cut off from meaning, from purpose, from any sense of connection to something transcendent. Life becomes empty, mechanical, pointless. This alienation, Edinger argued, was the defining psychological problem of modern Western culture, the root cause of the epidemic of meaninglessness that characterized the 20th century. Neurotic symptoms from this perspective are the self's attempts to get the ego's attention, to force consciousness to recognize that something is wrong in the relationship. Depression is often a message that the ego has become too identified with persona, with external achievement, and has lost touch with the deeper self. Anxiety may signal that the ego is avoiding some necessary development that the self is trying to initiate. Even severe pathologies like psychosis can be understood as an overwhelming influx of archetypal content from the self, breaking through an ego too weak to contain it. The goal of Jungian therapy, in Edinger's formulation, is to repair and strengthen the ego-self axis. This involves helping the patient recognize that their suffering is not meaningless but symbolic, that symptoms are messages that need to be decoded rather than simply eliminated. The therapist serves as a kind of translator, helping the patient learn the symbolic language through which the self communicates. Central, too, this process is what Edinger called symbolic attitude, the ability to see through the literal to the archetypal, to recognize that one's personal dramas are also enactments of universal patterns. A man going through a divorce, for instance, is not just experiencing a personal tragedy, but is also living through the archetypal motif of the separation of opposites, the breaking apart that precedes a new synthesis. A woman struggling with career decisions is also wrestling with the archetypal problem of vocation, of discovering what one is called to do. Developing symbolic attitude allows the ego to reconnect with the self because it recognizes that personal experience participates in archetypal reality. The boundary between individual and collective, personal and transpersonal, begins to become permeable. One discovers that one's own life is mythic, that it contains patterns and meanings that transcend the merely biographical. This, for Edinger, was the essence of psychological healing, the restoration of the ego, self-connection through the cultivation of symbolic consciousness. And unlike Jung, who presented his ideas in fragmentary, unsystematic ways, Edinger organized this process into clear stages with identifiable markers and practical applications. He identified distinct phases in the development and repair of the ego, self-relationship. There was the phase of ego formation and strengthening, necessary for young people and for anyone whose ego is too weak or fragmented. There was the phase of ego, self-separation, the painful but necessary movement into alienation and individual consciousness. There was the phase of ego inflation, when the ego identifies with archetypal energies and imagines itself godlike. There was the phase of deflation, when the ego recognizes its limitations and mortality. And there was the phase of conscious ego, self-reunion, the goal of individuation, in which the ego learns to serve the self consciously while maintaining its own integrity. Each phase had its characteristic dreams, its typical problems, its necessary tasks. A therapist, trained in Edinger's framework, could identify where a patient was in this developmental sequence and what they needed to move forward. This was practical, applicable, teachable in a way that Jung's more mystical formulations were not. But what did this systematization gain, and what did it lose? To explore this question, we must look more carefully at the differences between Jung's approach to the ego, self-relationship, and Edinger's systematization of it. The differences are subtle but significant, revealing two distinct temperaments, two different ways of relating to psychological reality. Jung's approach to the ego-self relationship was fundamentally phenomenological and experiential. He described what he himself had experienced and what he observed in his patients, but he deliberately avoided creating definitive models or developmental schemas. This was partly because he felt each individual's journey was unique, irreducible to a common pattern. But it was also because Jung recognized that the self itself was not a static entity but a living mystery that revealed itself differently to each person. For Jung, the self was numinous, a concept borrowed from Rudolf Otto's description of religious experience. The numinous is that which inspires awe and dread simultaneously, which draws us toward it even as it overwhelms us with its otherness. Jung's descriptions of self-experiences always retained this quality of overwhelming presence, of encounter with something genuinely other than ego consciousness. When Jung spoke of the ego-self relationship, he used language that preserved this numinosity. The self was the inner friend, the unknown God, the source of healing and wholeness, but also a power that could destroy the ego through inflation. Approaching the self was dangerous, requiring what Jung called religious attitude, a sense of standing before something sacred that demanded reverence and humility. Moreover, Jung insisted that the self could never be fully known or comprehended by the ego. It was, by definition, that which transcended ego consciousness. One could experience it, relate to it, be guided by it, but one could never master it or fully understand it. The relationship between ego and self was ultimately a mystery, analogous to the mystical relationship between the human soul and God. This meant that Jung's psychology retained an irreducible element of uncertainty and open-endedness. He could describe patterns and offer interpretations, but he always maintained that other interpretations might be equally valid, that the symbols and dreams sent by the self could be understood in multiple ways. There was no single correct reading of a dream, no definitive way to interpret a symbol, because the self spoke in a language that was inherently polysemous, multi-layered, inexhaustible. Edinger, by contrast, brought to Jung's ideas what we might call a theological clarity. Where Jung maintained mystery and ambiguity, Edinger sought definition and structure. Where Jung spoke in conditional and exploratory language, perhaps, it seems, one might say, Edinger spoke with greater certainty and precision. Where Jung deliberately avoided creating a systematic developmental model, Edinger created precisely such a model. This difference reflects, in part, their different life experiences and temperaments. Jung had come to his insights through a harrowing personal descent into the unconscious, an experience that left him with profound respect for the autonomy and power of the psyche's depths. He knew firsthand how easily the ego could be overwhelmed, how dangerous it was to approach the unconscious with too much certainty or systematic intention. Edinger, on the other hand, came to Jung's ideas through study and training rather than through overwhelming personal crisis. He had the luxury of approaching the unconscious through the mediation of Jung's writings and of his analysts. While he certainly had his own inner experiences and struggles, he did not undergo the kind of world-shattering confrontation with the unconscious that Jung had. This allowed him to approach Jung's ideas with more objectivity, to organize and systematize them without the paralyzing sense of their dangerous power. Moreover, Edinger's cultural context was different from Jung's. He was a mid-20th century American, shaped by a culture that valued clarity, practicality, and systematic organization. The American temperament tends toward the pragmatic. If an idea can't be applied, what use is it? Jung's European mysticism needed to be translated into something more concrete, more structured, to be useful in the American context. Edinger's great gift was his ability to perform this translation without completely betraying Jung's vision. He understood that Jung's insights were profound and true, but he also understood that they needed to be made more accessible if they were to help the many people suffering from the meaninglessness of modern life. His systematization was an act of love, an attempt to share what he had found in Jung with as many people as possible. Yet something was inevitably lost in this translation. By organizing the ego-self relationship into clear developmental stages, Edinger made it seem more comprehensible, more manageable than Jung ever intended. The numinous quality of self-experience, the sense of standing before an overwhelming mystery, was somewhat diminished when the self became primarily an organizing principle, the top of a developmental schema. Jung had spoken of the self with trembling, with awe, with the language of mystical encounter. Edinger spoke of the self with reverence, certainly, but also with a professor's clarity, a clinician's precision. The self, in Edinger's presentations, became something that could be understood, mapped, related to through identifiable stages and processes. This was tremendously useful for teaching and therapy, but it risked domesticating something that Jung had insisted must remain wild, autonomous, beyond the ego's full comprehension. Consider, for instance, how each man approached the interpretation of dreams. For Jung, dream interpretation was an art, not a science. He would sit with a dream, amplify its images through cross-cultural research, explore its personal associations, consider its compensatory relationship to the dreamer's conscious attitude, but he never claimed to arrive at a definitive interpretation. A dream was like a poem or a work of art. It meant something, certainly, but its meaning could not be reduced to a simple translation. The dreamer lived into its meaning over time, discovering new layers as consciousness evolved. Jung would often tell dreamers, "I don't know what your dream means. Let's explore it together." He maintained a stance of genuine not knowing, of approaching each dream as a fresh mystery. He had principles and methods, certainly, but he held them lightly, always ready to discover that a particular dream violated the usual patterns, that the unconscious had found a new way to express itself. Edinger, while he certainly acknowledged the complexity of dreams, tended toward more definitive interpretations. He had a framework, the ego, self-axis, the stages of development, the standard symbols and their meanings, and he used this framework to decode dreams with considerable confidence. A dream of falling might indicate deflation, a necessary letting go of ego inflation. A dream of ascending might indicate inflation, the ego identifying with archetypal energies. A mandala dream indicated the self's attempt to create new psychic order. These interpretations were often correct and helpful. Edinger's framework gave him and his students a powerful tool for understanding symbolic material, but the trade-off was a certain loss of openness, a tendency to fit dreams into pre-existing categories, rather than letting each dream reveal its own unique logic. This difference becomes even more apparent when we consider how Jung and Edinger approached the symbolic interpretation of cultural material myths, religious texts, alchemical treatises, works of art. Both men were deeply committed to symbolic interpretation, believing that these cultural products revealed archetypal patterns that illuminated the structure of the psyche. But their styles of interpretation were distinctly different. Jung's approach to myth and symbol was exploratory, comparative, and open-ended. He would take a mythological motif, say, the hero's journey, or the divine child, or the conjunctio of masculine and feminine, and trace its manifestations across multiple cultures and historical periods. He would show how the same basic pattern appeared in Greek myth, in alchemy, in Christian symbolism, in Eastern philosophy, in the dreams of modern patience. Through this process of amplification, the mythological motif would reveal itself as an archetypal pattern, a universal structure of human experience. But Jung rarely insisted on a single definitive meaning for a symbol. The hero's journey, for instance, could represent the ego's development out of the unconscious, or the conscious ego's descent into the unconscious for renewal, or the self's manifestation in consciousness, or the individuation process as a whole. All of these interpretations were valid, depending on context. The symbol was polysemous, capable of multiple simultaneous meanings. Moreover, Jung allowed himself to be surprised by symbols, to discover meanings he hadn't anticipated. His long study of alchemy is a perfect example. He began investigating alchemical texts in the 1920s, primarily to find parallels to the individuation process, but the more he studied, the more he discovered layers of meaning he hadn't expected. Alchemy wasn't just a disguised psychology. It was also a religious attitude, a proto-scientific investigation of matter, a mystical discipline, a symbolic expression of the relationship between spirit and matter. Jung's alchemical studies sprawled across decades and thousands of pages precisely because he kept finding new dimensions, new connections, new layers of significance. Edinger also engaged deeply with myth and alchemy, producing important works on the Bible as Jungian psychology and on alchemical symbolism as a map of individuation. But his approach was more systematic, more focused on extracting clear developmental meanings from the symbolic material. Where Jung would amplify a symbol endlessly, following its threads into multiple directions, Edinger would organize the symbol into his framework, showing how it illuminated a particular stage or aspect of the ego, self-relationship. Take Edinger's treatment of the biblical story of Job, which became one of his most important works. Jung had written about Job in his controversial Answer to Job, interpreting the story as revealing an unconscious shadow in the God image, a God who treats Job cruelly without justification, forcing a moral consciousness to develop that transcends God's own amorality. It was a wild, provocative reading that offended many religious readers because it seemed to be psychoanalyzing God himself. Edinger also wrote extensively on Job, but his interpretation was more contained, more clearly focused on the story's psychological meaning for the individual. Job represented the suffering ego confronted by the overwhelming power of the self. Job's trials were an initiation, a process by which the ego is stripped of its identifications and inflations and brought into direct relationship with the numinous. The restoration at the end of the story represented the ego, self-reunion after the necessary ordeal of separation. This interpretation was profound and helpful to many readers. It made the Job story psychologically accessible, showing how an ancient text spoke to the timeless problem of suffering and meaning. But compared to Jung's reading, it was also more tidy, more organized, less disturbing. Jung's job was genuinely tragic and paradoxical, revealing an actual problem in the nature of the divine. Edinger's job was difficult but ultimately positive, a necessary step in psychological development. This pattern repeats throughout Edinger's work. He took Jung's sprawling, often cryptic explorations of symbol and myth and organized them into teachable schemas. The alchemical process, which Jung had explored through hundreds of pages of dense amplification, became, in Edinger's hands, a clear sequence of psychological stages. The nigredo, or blackening, representing depression and dissolution, the albedo, or whitening, representing purification, the citronitas, or yellowing, representing emerging consciousness, the rubedo, or reddening, representing the achievement of wholeness. Each stage had its characteristic experiences, its typical dreams, its necessary tasks. The nigredo was the dark night of the soul, when all meaning collapsed. The albedo was the emergence of new perspective through the washing away of old attitudes. The citronitas was the dawning of new consciousness. The rubedo was the achievement of the inner marriage, the union of opposites, the manifestation of the individuated self. This schema was immensely useful for understanding the individuation process, for helping patients recognize where they were in their journey, for providing hope that the suffering they were experiencing was part of a meaningful pattern rather than mere chaos. But again, something of Jung's sense of alchemy's genuine mystery, its irreducibility to a single psychological meaning, was lost in the systematization. The difference between Jung and Edinger might be characterized as the difference between mysticism and theology. Jung was fundamentally a mystic, someone who had direct experience of the numinous and who tried to remain faithful to that experience even when it couldn't be fully articulated. His psychology was an attempt to create space for the numinous in a culture that had lost touch with it, but he knew that the numinous itself couldn't be captured in concepts or systems. Edinger was fundamentally a theologian, someone who took the mystic's experience and organized it into coherent doctrine, into teachable principles, into a systematic understanding that could be shared with a community. Theology is essential. Without it, mystical experience remains private and incommunicable. But theology also necessarily reduces the richness of mystical experience to something more manageable, more comprehensible. This distinction illuminates another key difference between Jung and Edinger, their relationship to Western religious tradition, particularly Christianity. Both men took Christianity seriously as a symbolic system, revealing archetypal truths, but they approached it from different angles. Jung's relationship with Christianity was deeply ambivalent. He had grown up as the son and grandson of Swiss Reformed ministers, surrounded by a Christianity that felt, to him, dead and hollow. The ministers he knew, including his father, mouthed doctrines they no longer truly believed, performed rituals that had lost their numinous power. Jung's whole psychological project was, in some sense, an attempt to recover what Christianity had once provided a living connection to the numinous, a symbolic system through which the self could be experienced, but to do so in a way that didn't require accepting literal dogmas that modern consciousness could no longer believe. Jung, therefore, treated Christian symbols as psychological rather than theological truths. The Trinity represented the structure of the complete psyche, with the Father as the ego, the Son as the self, and the Holy Spirit as the relationship between them. The Virgin Mary represented the integration of the feminine that Christianity had inadequately incorporated. Christ's death and resurrection symbolized the ego's necessary sacrifice and renewal through contact with the unconscious. Satan represented the shadow, the dark side, that Christianity had split off rather than integrated. These interpretations allowed modern people to find psychological truth in Christian symbols without having to believe in their literal historical reality. This was tremendously liberating for many of Jung's patients and readers who had lost faith in traditional Christianity but still yearned for the meaning and connection it once provided. But Jung's approach was also, from a traditional Christian perspective, deeply heretical. He was essentially saying that God is a psychological reality, that religious experience is an experience of the self rather than of an objectively existing deity. This collapsed the transcendent into the immanent, the divine into the psychological. Many Christians saw this as a subtle form of atheism, a reduction of God to a mere psychological projection. Jung always insisted that he was not making metaphysical claims, only psychological ones. He didn't know whether God existed independently of the psyche. He only knew that there was a God image within the psyche, and that relating to this image was psychologically crucial. Whether this God image corresponded to an objective transcendent reality was, Jung said, beyond his competence as a psychologist to determine. This distinction satisfied Jung, but it bothered many of his readers, including Edinger. Edinger wanted to affirm more strongly the spiritual dimension of Jung's psychology, to show that Jung's insights confirmed rather than undermined religious truth. Where Jung maintained a carefully agnostic stance, neither affirming nor denying the objective existence of God, Edinger leaned toward a more openly religious interpretation. For Edinger, Jung's discovery of the self was a rediscovery of what religion had always known, that there is a divine center within the human being, and that conscious relationship to this center is the purpose of human existence. The ego self-axis was another name for what mystics had called the relationship between the soul and God. Individuation was another name for what Christianity had called salvation, what Buddhism had called enlightenment, what Hinduism had called moksha. Edinger therefore saw his work as building a bridge between Jungian psychology and traditional religious language. He wanted to show that Jung's psychology, far from being a secular replacement for religion, was actually a path back to authentic religious experience. The symbols of Christianity, the cross, the crucifixion and resurrection, the incarnation, the virgin birth, were not just psychological metaphors, but also legitimate expressions of archetypal reality, ways of speaking about truths that transcended the purely personal psyche. This made Edinger's work more acceptable to religious readers than Jung's had been. Where Jung's psychology could seem like a sophisticated form of secular humanism, reducing religion to psychology, Edinger's explicitly affirmed the spiritual dimension. He spoke of the self not just as an archetype, but as the God image, and he was willing to blur the line between the psychological and the metaphysical in ways that Jung carefully avoided. This difference is especially evident in how each man approached the problem of evil and the shadow. For Jung, evil was a genuine reality that had to be integrated rather than simply opposed. The shadow, the personal and collective darkness within human nature, was not just the absence of good, but something positive, something that had its own energy and reality. Jung was even willing to entertain the idea that God himself contained a dark side, a shadow, and that human consciousness had evolved to become more moral than the amoral divine image revealed in texts like the Book of Job. This was radical and disturbing. It meant that psychological wholeness required integrating evil, acknowledging one's capacity for darkness without acting it out destructively. It meant recognizing that what we call evil is often simply rejected or repressed aspects of the psyche seeking expression. It meant accepting moral ambiguity as a permanent condition of human existence rather than something that could be overcome through faith or right action. Edinger took the integration of the shadow seriously, but he framed it in more traditionally moral language. The shadow needed to be integrated, yes, but ultimately in service of a greater good, in service of the self's drive toward wholeness. Evil, in Edinger's framework, was primarily the result of ego, self-alienation, of the loss of connection to the divine center. When that connection was restored, one naturally aligned with what was good and true. This was more reassuring than Jung's view, which offered no such guarantee. For Jung, integrating the shadow didn't necessarily make you morally better. It made you more conscious, more whole, but also more dangerous in some ways because you had access to your own capacity for evil. The individuated person was not necessarily a good person in conventional terms, but rather a complete person, someone who had integrated their light and dark sides into a conscious unity. Edinger's more moralistic framing of Jung's ideas made them more palatable to mainstream audiences, but also potentially diluted their radicalism. Jung was asking people to accept genuine paradoxes and ambiguities. Edinger was offering a clearer path with more defined goals and stages. Another significant difference between Jung and Edinger concerns the nature of the therapeutic relationship and the role of the analyst. Jung saw analysis as fundamentally a relationship between two people, each with their own unconscious processes, engaging in what he called a dialectical process. The analyst was not a neutral interpreter or a technique applier, but a participant in a mutual journey. The analyst's own dreams and feelings about the patient were part of the process, part of the unconscious communication happening between two psyches. Jung spoke of the analyst being in the analysis as much as the patient, being affected and changed by the encounter. He famously said that he tried to learn something new from every patient, to approach each case fresh rather than applying predetermined formulas. The analyst needed to be individuated, or at least deeply engaged in their own individuation process, because they would be called upon to respond authentically to whatever emerged in the therapeutic relationship. This meant that Jungian analysis, as Jung practiced it, was somewhat unpredictable and unstructured. Sessions might focus on dreams or on the present relationship between analyst and patient, or on philosophical and spiritual questions. Jung might share his own experiences or remain silent. He might interpret symbolically or engage concretely with practical life problems. Each analysis was unique, shaped by the particular interaction between those two individuals at that moment in their respective journeys. Edinger maintained this emphasis on the importance of the therapeutic relationship, but he also provided more structure and guidance about how to conduct analysis within his framework. He taught specific techniques for working with the ego, self-axis, ways to identify where a patient was developmentally, methods for helping patients develop symbolic attitude. While he acknowledged that each case was unique, he also provided a template that analysts could follow. This made Jungian analysis more teachable and transmissible. A student of Edinger's would have clearer guidelines about how to work with dreams, how to identify and address ego inflation or deflation, how to recognize when the self was trying to communicate through symptoms. They wouldn't be left, as some of Jung's students were, trying to intuit how the master worked and hoping to absorb his approach through osmosis. But the trade-off, again, was a certain loss of openness and spontaneity. If the analyst comes into the session with a clear framework of developmental stages and ego, self-dynamics, there's a risk of fitting the patient into the framework rather than letting the patient's unique process reveal itself. The framework can become a subtle imposition, a way for the analyst to maintain control and certainty rather than genuinely entering into the uncertainty of the unconscious process. Jung had always warned against this danger. He was suspicious of techniques and methods precisely because they could become defenses against the genuine encounter with the unconscious. The analyst who knows too much, who has too clear a framework, might miss the unique ways the unconscious is trying to speak. Better to maintain a certain not knowing, a certain humility before the mystery of each individual psyche. Yet, Edinger would counter that without some framework. Analysis becomes hopelessly idiosyncratic, dependent entirely on the analyst's personal charisma or intuition. How do you train new analysts if there's no systematic approach to teach? How do you evaluate whether an analysis is going well or poorly if there are no common standards? How do you help patients if you have no clear sense of what psychological health and development look like? This tension between systematic method and open-ended exploration, between teachable framework and unique encounter, runs throughout the Jung-Edinger relationship. It's not a tension that can be finally resolved, because both sides have legitimate claims. Psychology needs both the mystic, who preserves the sense of mystery, and the theologian, who makes the mystery accessible. As we drift deeper into the comparison, let us consider how Jung and Edinger each understood the central goal of psychological work, what Jung called individuation, and what Edinger framed as the development of ego, self-relationship. Though they used similar language, subtle differences in emphasis revealed different visions of psychological maturity. For Jung, individuation was a lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, of realizing the unique pattern of wholeness that is potential within each person. It was not about achieving perfection or about becoming a better person in conventional moral terms. Rather, it was about becoming more fully yourself, more complete, integrating the unlived aspects of personality, the rejected and repressed parts, into conscious awareness. Jung emphasized that individuation often set one apart from collective norms and values. The individuated person might appear odd or unconventional to others because they were living according to their own inner law, rather than collective expectations. They had sacrificed collective adaptation for individual authenticity, and this sacrifice often involved real loneliness and difficulty. Moreover, individuation for Jung was never complete. It was an asymptotic process. You approached wholeness but never fully achieved it. There was always more to integrate, always deeper layers of the unconscious to encounter. The self remained partly unknown, partly beyond the ego's grasp. This meant that psychological work was never finished. that one remained a student of the unconscious throughout life. Jung also stressed that individuation was not for everyone. It was a calling, a vocation that some people felt and others didn't. Many people were content to live collectively adapted lives, following social norms and expectations, and this was perfectly fine. Individuation was not a universal imperative but a specific path for those who felt the inner demand to become themselves. Edinger's understanding of individuation was similar in many respects, but with some significant differences in emphasis. He saw the development of ego-self relationship as the central task of psychological maturity, and he described this development in more universally applicable terms. While he acknowledged that not everyone would fully individuate, he presented the strengthening of the ego-self axis as something everyone needed to some degree. In Edinger's framework, psychological health was measured by the strength and consciousness of the ego, self-connection. A healthy person might not be fully individuated, but they would have a functioning relationship to the self, a sense that life has meaning, a feeling of being connected to something greater than the personal ego. This was less elitist than Jung's formulation, more democratic in its application. Edinger also emphasized the moral dimension of individuation more explicitly than Jung did. For Edinger, developing ego, self-relationship naturally led toward what he called ethical individuation, a sense of responsibility not just to one's own wholeness but to the wholeness of the world. The individuated person, in Edinger's vision, took on what he called the burden of the ego, the responsibility of being a conscious carrier of meaning in a world threatened by meaninglessness. This gave Edinger's psychology a more explicitly moral and even missionary quality. He saw Jungian psychology as a potential answer to the spiritual crisis of modern Western culture, a way to restore meaning in a world that had lost it through scientific materialism and the death of God. The analyst, in this vision, was not just a healer of individual neurosis, but a kind of spiritual guide helping people reconnect with the sacred dimension of existence. Jung would likely have been uncomfortable with this formulation. He resisted positioning himself or his psychology as having answers to the world's problems. He was deeply skeptical of collective solutions en masse, movements, even psychological ones. Each person had to find their own way, through their own suffering and their own encounter with the unconscious. There was no collective path to salvation, no technique that could be universally applied. Yet Edinger's more missionary approach had its own validity. The mid to late 20th century really was experiencing a crisis of meaning, an epidemic of what Viktor Frankl called the existential vacuum. People were suffering not just from neurotic symptoms, but from a profound sense that life was empty, pointless, devoid of transcendent significance. In this context, offering a structured path toward meaning, a systematic understanding of how to reconnect ego and self, was a genuine act of compassion and service. Edinger's work can thus be seen as Jung's psychology adapted for the specific needs of the modern meaning crisis. Where Jung had been content to work with individual patients and to let his books find their readers organically, Edinger took on the work of actively teaching and spreading Jungian ideas, of creating institutions and training programs, of systematizing the work so it could be more widely practiced. This difference in approach is also visible in how each man wrote and taught. Jung's writing style was dense, elusive, meandering. He would begin discussing one topic and end up somewhere entirely different, following the associative threads wherever they led. His books often grew out of lectures or seminars, preserving their oral, exploratory quality. He used extensive quotations from obscure sources, assumed his readers had broad knowledge of mythology and religion and philosophy, and rarely explained things in simple, direct terms. Reading Jung can be frustrating. Just when you think you're starting to understand a concept, he qualifies it, complicates it, shows you another angle that contradicts what he just said. His famous Answer to Job, for instance, shifts between psychological interpretation, theological speculation, and personal outrage in ways that leave many readers confused about what Jung actually believes. But this frustrating quality was intentional. Jung didn't want to spoon-feed conclusions to readers. He wanted them to engage actively with the material, to struggle with it, to let it work on them rather than simply understanding it intellectually. Edinger's writing style was dramatically different. He wrote clearly, systematically, with careful organization and frequent summaries. His books and lectures were models of lucidity, taking complex ideas and presenting them in accessible language with helpful diagrams and examples. Where Jung might spend 50 pages amplifying a single alchemical image, Edinger would distill the essential psychological meaning in a few pages and move on. This made Edinger's work far more accessible to general readers and students. You could pick up an Edinger book like Ego and Archetype, or The Creation of Consciousness, and come away with a clear understanding of his main points. You could take notes, create outlines, apply what you learned. This was much harder to do with Jung, whose work resisted such systematization. But again, what was gained in clarity was sometimes lost in depth. Jung's difficult, meandering style forced readers to slow down, to meditate on what they were reading, to let the material work on them at multiple levels. You couldn't speed read Jung. You had to sit with him, let the images and ideas percolate. Edinger's clearer style allowed faster comprehension, but perhaps less transformative impact. The difference in writing styles reflects a deeper difference in how each man related to knowledge and understanding. For Jung, knowledge was experiential and participatory. You didn't truly understand an archetype by learning its definition. You understood it by experiencing it, in dreams, in life events, in moments of numinous encounter. Jung's writing tried to evoke these experiences, rather than simply explain them. He wanted readers to be touched by the unconscious through reading, not just to learn about it intellectually. Edinger, while he certainly valued experiential knowledge, placed more emphasis on conceptual understanding. He believed that clear concepts were themselves valuable, that understanding the framework of ego, self-relationship intellectually, could facilitate and deepen one's experiential process. Knowledge and experience could work together rather than being opposed. This brings us to one of the most interesting points of comparison, how Jung and Edinger each related to the symbolic material of alchemy. Both devoted enormous energy to studying alchemical texts and interpreting them psychologically. Both saw alchemy as a disguised or projected psychology, with the alchemist's work on metals actually representing the psyche's work on itself. But their approaches to this material, while similar in many ways, reveal characteristic differences. Jung came to alchemy through dreams. In the 1920s, he began having dreams filled with strange images, circular structures, transforming substances, mysterious processes of heating and cooling and distillation. He didn't know what these images meant until he encountered an alchemical text, the Rosarium Philosophorum, and recognized that his dream images were similar to the illustrations in this 15th century work. This led Jung into a decades-long study of alchemy that became one of his central preoccupations. He collected hundreds of alchemical texts, learned medieval Latin to read them in the original, traced the development of alchemical symbolism across centuries and cultures. What he discovered was a rich symbolic language describing psychological transformation in terms of chemical operations. But Jung's relationship to alchemy was never purely scholarly. He felt that the alchemists had stumbled upon genuine psychological truths that, in projecting their unconscious contents onto metals and chemical processes, they had created a symbolic system that revealed how the psyche actually works. The alchemical opus, the great work of transforming base metal into gold, was an image of individuation, the transformation of the unrealized personality into conscious wholeness. Jung's major alchemical works, Psychology and Alchemy, Mysterium Coniunctionis, Alchemical Studies, are strange, beautiful, difficult books. They're filled with long quotations from obscure Latin texts, with reproductions of bizarre medieval illustrations, with Jung's amplifications and interpretations. Reading them is like wandering through a vast, complex symbol system where everything connects to everything else in multiple ways. Jung never tried to reduce alchemy to a simple schema. He showed how different alchemical operations, nigredo, albedo, citrinitas, rubedo, represented stages of psychological transformation, but he also showed how these stages overlapped, repeated, reversed. He explored how the alchemical marriage of sun and moon represented the union of masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, but he also showed how this central image appeared in dozens of different forms, each with its own nuances. Most importantly, Jung maintained that alchemy preserved something Christianity had lost: the redemption of matter, the understanding that spirit and matter were not separate but different aspects of a single underlying reality. The alchemists sought to transform matter itself, to redeem the darkness, to unite the above and below. This was a more complete vision than Christianity's rejection of matter and the body in favor of pure spirit. Edinger also studied alchemy intensively and wrote several books exploring its psychological meaning, but his approach was more systematizing, more focused on extracting clear developmental stages from the complex alchemical material. In his book, Anatomy of the Psyche, Edinger presented the alchemical operations as a sequential process of psychological transformation, each stage with its characteristic experiences and tasks. The nigredo, Edinger explained, was depression, meaninglessness, the dark night of the soul, the ego's encounter with its own limitations and mortality. The albedo was purification, the washing away of old attitudes, the emergence of new clarity. The citrinitas was the growth of solar consciousness, increasing awareness and understanding. The rubedo was the achievement of wholeness, the inner marriage that united all previously split aspects of personality. This schema was immensely useful for understanding the individuation process in practical terms. A patient in the depths of depression could be helped by understanding that they were in the nigredo stage, that this darkness was necessary and meaningful, that it was preparing the ground for new growth. This gave hope and context to suffering that might otherwise feel meaningless. But Edinger's systematization also somewhat simplified alchemy's wild profusion of images and operations. He tended to emphasize the progressive, developmental aspects of alchemy, the movement from dark to light, from base to noble, from fragmented to whole. Jung had certainly seen these progressive aspects, but had also emphasized how alchemical work was circular, repetitive, how you returned again and again to the same issues at different levels. Moreover, Edinger interpreted alchemy more consistently in ethical and spiritual terms. The alchemical transformation was, for Edinger, ultimately about becoming more conscious, more ethical, more aligned with the self's purposes. Jung had been more ambiguous about the moral implications of alchemical work, more willing to acknowledge its dark dimensions, its potential for producing monsters as well as gold. These differences in approach to alchemy reflect the larger pattern we've been tracing: Jung's preservation of mystery, multiplicity, and paradox versus Edinger's systematization, clarification, and ethical framing. Neither approach is right or wrong. They serve different purposes and appeal to different temperaments. As we move deeper into our exploration, let us consider what these two approaches reveal about the nature of psychological knowledge itself. Is the psyche ultimately knowable, mappable, reducible to comprehensible structures and stages, or is it fundamentally mysterious, inexhaustible, always exceeding our attempts to contain it in concepts and systems? Jung leaned toward the second view. He felt that the unconscious was by definition inexhaustible, that consciousness could never fully comprehend or master it. New contents were always emerging, new symbols appearing, new patterns revealing themselves. The self remained ultimately mysterious, wholly other in Otto's phrase, something that could be experienced but never fully known. This led Jung to emphasize limits, humility, the acknowledgement of not knowing. The analyst doesn't have answers. The analyst accompanies the patient into the unknown, learning alongside them what the unconscious is trying to communicate. Theory and frameworks are useful but must be held lightly, always ready to be discarded when they no longer fit the unique reality of this particular person's process. Edinger, while respecting the mystery of the psyche, placed more confidence in our ability to understand its basic structures and patterns. The ego-self axis was a real structure that could be identified and worked with. The stages of development were real, even if each person moved through them in their own unique way. Having clear concepts and frameworks didn't eliminate mystery, but rather helped us engage with it more effectively. This difference points to a fundamental tension in all of psychology, the tension between understanding and experience, between concept and encounter, between the map and the territory. We need maps, frameworks and theories that help us orient ourselves in the vast terrain of the psyche. But we must never confuse the map for the territory. Never imagine that our concepts capture the full reality of psychological experience. Jung excelled at reminding us that the map is not the territory, that all our theories are provisional, that the psyche will always surprise us if we remain open to its movements. Edinger excelled at providing better maps, clearer and more useful than what had existed before. Maps that could guide people through difficult territory. In the temple of depth psychology, we might say, Jung was the high priest who maintained the sacred mysteries, while Edinger was the teacher who made the mysteries accessible to initiates. Both roles are necessary. Without the mystic who preserves the original vision in all its paradoxical fullness, the tradition loses its soul, becomes merely a technique or methodology. Without the theologian who systematizes and clarifies, the tradition remains inaccessible, trapped in the private experience of a few initiates. The story of Jung and Edinger is thus the story of how depth psychology moved from its charismatic founding generation to becoming a sustainable tradition. Jung was the founder, the one who had the original vision through his own harrowing encounter with the unconscious. He spoke from direct experience with an authority that came from having been there, having faced the abyss and returned with maps to share. But precisely because his maps were drawn from such intense personal experience, they were difficult for others to read. They assumed the reader had similar experiences or was willing to undertake similar inner journeys. They couldn't easily be taught in classrooms or applied in clinical practice by people who hadn't undergone their own confrontation with the unconscious. Edinger and other second-generation Jungians took on the task of translation and systematization that made Jung's insights more widely applicable. They created training institutes, standardized curricula, clinical methodologies. They showed how Jung's concepts could be used to understand specific psychological problems and guide therapeutic interventions. This was essential institutional work. Without it, Jungian psychology might have remained a fascinating but marginal movement, the private vision of one brilliant, eccentric thinker. With it, Jungian psychology became a worldwide tradition, with training centers on every continent, thousands of practicing analysts, a substantial body of literature applying Jungian concepts to everything from therapy to education to business to politics. But institutionalization always comes at a cost. The wild original vision gets domesticated, made respectable, fitted into existing structures. The Jungian institutes that Edinger helped create became, in some ways, remarkably similar to the psychoanalytic institutes. Jung had rebelled against hierarchical, concerned with credentials and orthodoxy, sometimes more focused on preserving tradition than encouraging new discoveries. Edinger himself was aware of this danger. He warned against what he called concealed inflation, where Jungian analysts imagine they have special access to truth, where they become rigid in their attachment to Jung's concepts rather than remaining open to what the unconscious reveals. He emphasized that Jung's psychology was not a closed system, but a living tradition that must continue to evolve. Yet Edinger's very success at systematizing Jung's work sometimes worked against this openness. When you have a clear framework like the ego-self axis, when you have identifiable stages and patterns, there's a tendency to fit experiences into the framework rather than letting experiences challenge and expand the framework. The system can become a defense against genuine openness to the unknown. This is perhaps an inevitable tension in any spiritual or psychological tradition. The founder's original vision is always more radical, more open, more experimental than what the tradition becomes. Disciples and systematizers are necessary to preserve and transmit the vision, but something is always lost in transmission. Yet something is also gained. What is lost in numinous intensity is gained in applicability and accessibility. What is lost in radical openness is gained in clarity and teachability. The question is not whether systematization should happen, it inevitably does, but how to maintain connection to the living source even as the tradition becomes more structured. Edinger's great contribution was that he systematized Jung's psychology while remaining genuinely devoted to its core insights, while maintaining reverence for the numinous, while refusing to reduce the psyche to merely mechanical processes. His systematization remained soulful, remained connected to the reality of symbolic experience, remained open to the transcendent dimension. Consider, for instance, how Edinger approached clinical cases in his books and lectures. He would present a dream or a symptom and show how it could be understood within the ego, self-framework, what stage of development it indicated, what the self was trying to communicate. But he would also amplify the specific symbols, showing their cultural and historical resonances. allowing space for the unique quality of this particular person's experience. His case presentations were thus both systematic and particular, both frameworks and stories. He showed how the framework illuminated the case, but also how the case exceeded and enriched the framework. This maintained something of Jung's both-and thinking, his refusal of either-or simplifications. Edinger also explicitly acknowledged his debt to Jung and positioned himself as Jung's interpreter and student rather than as an innovator in his own right. He was remarkably free of the anxiety of influence that afflicts many intellectual descendants of great thinkers. He didn't need to differentiate himself dramatically from Jung or criticize Jung to establish his own authority. Rather, he saw his work as continuing Jung's project, making it more accessible and applicable, but not fundamentally changing it. This humility was one of Edinger's most attractive qualities. He could have claimed credit for the ego-self axis as his own discovery, his own theoretical contribution. Instead, he always insisted that the concept was present in Jung's work and that he had simply articulated it more systematically. This was technically true. Jung had certainly written about the ego-self relationship, but Edinger's formulation was sufficiently original and systematic that he could have claimed more credit than he did. His reluctance to claim originality reflected his understanding of how psychological knowledge develops. It's not about individual genius creating entirely new ideas ex nihilo. Rather, it's about insights emerging through a tradition, with each generation clarifying and building on what came before. Edinger saw himself as part of a lineage, standing on Jung's shoulders, looking slightly further or seeing slightly more clearly because of that elevated vantage point. This attitude toward tradition is itself deeply Jungian. Jung spoke often of how important it was to remain connected to one's cultural and psychological roots, to draw strength from the collective wisdom of the past, rather than imagining oneself completely autonomous and self-created. The individuated person, Jung insisted, is not cut off from tradition, but rather consciously relates to it, taking what is valuable and leaving what no longer serves. Edinger embodied this relationship to tradition in his work. He took what was valuable in Jung, the central insights about symbol, self, individuation, and developed them further. He left aside or de-emphasized aspects of Jung's work that seemed less central or useful, some of the more speculative metaphysical claims, some of the more cryptic alchemical explorations, and he added his own emphases, the systematic developmental framework, the clearer connection to Western religious symbolism, the more explicitly ethical framing. The result was a Jungian psychology that was both faithful to Jung and distinctly Edinger's own. This is how living traditions work. If disciples simply repeat the master's words, the tradition becomes dead, fossilized. If disciples completely depart from the master's vision, continuity is lost, and something new entirely is created. The art is in the balance, staying close enough to the source to maintain connection, but innovating enough to keep the tradition alive and relevant. Let us now drift deeper into one of the most profound areas where Jung and Edinger's approaches converged and diverged: their understanding of modern alienation and the cultural crisis of meaning. Both men saw psychological symptoms as inseparable from cultural context, and both believed that the particular psychological problems of modern Western people reflected a deeper spiritual crisis. Jung's diagnosis of modern alienation was rooted in his understanding of how Western culture had developed over centuries. The medieval world, despite its many problems, had provided a unified symbolic universe. God was real. The church provided communal rituals that connected people to the sacred. The natural world was enchanted with meaning. An individual's life fit into a cosmic story that gave it significance. This symbolic universe had been progressively dismantled by several centuries of rationalism, scientific materialism, and religious decline. The Enlightenment had dethroned God through reason. Science had reduced the cosmos to mere mechanism. Industrial capitalism had uprooted people from traditional communities and meaningful work. The result was a world of unprecedented material comfort, but profound spiritual poverty. Modern people, Jung observed, were suffering from what he called loss of soul. They had outer lives, careers, possessions, social roles, but these felt hollow, cut off from any deeper significance. Neurotic symptoms were the psyche's protest against this meaninglessness, the self's attempt to force the ego to recognize that something essential was missing. What was missing, Jung argued, was connection to the numinous, to the sacred, to the archetypal depths of the psyche that previous cultures had accessed through religious ritual and myth. Modern people had lost this connection because they had literalized and then rejected the old religious symbols. Unable to believe in a literal heaven and hell, they had thrown out the baby with the bathwater, losing touch with the psychological and spiritual realities these symbols had pointed toward. Jung's solution, if it can be called that, was not to try to restore literal religious belief, which he felt was impossible for modern consciousness. Rather, it was to rediscover the sacred through direct psychological experience, through analysis, through active imagination, through attention to dreams and symbols. Modern individuals could recover connection to the self, to the archetypal depths, to the numinous dimension of existence. This recovery of meaning would be individual rather than collective. The old shared symbolic systems were dead or dying. Modern people had to find their own individual paths to the sacred. This was both liberating, no longer bound by collective dogmas, and isolating. The individuating person would often feel alone, unable to share their deepest experiences with a community that no longer spoke a symbolic language. Jung was not optimistic about the possibility of creating new collective symbols that could replace Christianity for Western culture. He thought it might take centuries for such symbols to emerge organically from the collective unconscious. In the meantime, individuals who undertook the work of individuation could find personal meaning, but they would remain somewhat alienated from collective culture. Edinger shared Jung's diagnosis of modern alienation, but was more explicit about its moral dimensions and more hopeful about psychology's potential to address it. He described modern alienation in terms of ego, self-separation taken to a pathological extreme. Western culture had created an increasingly inflated ego consciousness that imagined itself autonomous and self-sufficient, cut off from any sense of connection to something greater. This inflation manifested in various ways. Scientific materialism's claim that consciousness could fully understand and control reality, capitalism's glorification of individual achievement and acquisition, the breakdown of any sense of the sacred or transcendent. Modern people lived entirely on the ego level, identified with their personal will and consciousness, with no relationship to the self. The result was the epidemic of meaninglessness that characterized 20th century life. People achieved success by external standards but felt empty. Material prosperity increased while depression and anxiety rates soared. Despite unprecedented knowledge and technology, life felt pointless. But where Jung seemed resigned to this being the condition of modern life, at least for the foreseeable future, Edinger saw the potential for a cultural transformation. He believed that Jungian psychology, properly understood and widely disseminated, could provide a new symbolic framework for meaning-making in the modern world. The ego's self-axis could become a new myth, a new way of understanding the relationship between human consciousness and the divine center. Edinger spoke explicitly of the need for a new dispensation, a new understanding of the relationship between human and divine that could replace the old Christian framework. This new understanding would be based on psychological experience rather than revealed doctrine. It would recognize the self as the God within, the divine center that each person could access through inner work. This was a bold vision, positioning Jungian psychology as potentially a new religious framework for Western culture. It went beyond Jung's more modest claim that analysis could help individuals recover meaning. Edinger was suggesting that Jung's psychology could provide the foundation for cultural renewal, for a new covenant between human consciousness and the sacred. This more ambitious vision reflected Edinger's American optimism and his sense of historical urgency. Writing primarily in the 60s through the 90s, Edinger witnessed the counterculture's search for meaning, the New Age movement's hunger for transcendence, the widespread sense that Western culture was in crisis. He saw both the opportunity and the need for psychology to step into the void left by religion's decline. Jung, writing earlier and, from a more European perspective, had been more cautious about psychology's potential role. He worried about psychology becoming a new ideology, a new collective belief system that would ultimately prove as limiting as the old religious dogmas. He wanted individuals to find their own way rather than following any prescribed path, even a psychological one. Yet both men agreed on the fundamental problem that modern consciousness had achieved ego development at the cost of losing connection to the self, and that healing required restoring that connection while maintaining the hard-won gains of individual consciousness. The individuated person would be neither merged with the collective unconscious like a primitive person, nor completely cut off from it like a modern rationalist, but rather consciously related to both ego and self, individual and archetypal. The question was how this restoration could happen, and here Jung and Edinger's approaches differed in emphasis. Jung focused on the individual therapeutic process, one person at a time working with their dreams, doing active imagination, gradually building relationship with the unconscious. He was skeptical of mass movements and collective solutions, having witnessed how easily collective psychology became possessed by archetypal forces in dangerous ways. Fascism and communism were, for Jung, examples of what happened when unconscious archetypal energies seized collective consciousness. Edinger, while certainly valuing individual work, also emphasized education and cultural transmission. He devoted enormous energy to teaching, writing books for general audiences, giving lectures, training analysts. He wanted to spread Jungian ideas as widely as possible, believing that even people who never entered analysis could benefit from understanding the ego. Self-relationship could learn to read their lives symbolically. This difference reflects different assessments of both the opportunity and the danger Jung saw. The danger of psychology becoming a mass movement, becoming another form of collective inflation. Edinger saw the opportunity for psychology to genuinely help a culture in crisis, and felt the danger of remaining too insular, too focused on the analytic consulting room while the world suffered. Both assessments contained truth. Jungian psychology has indeed sometimes become a new belief system, with its own orthodoxies and group identifications that can be as limiting as what they replace. but it has also helped countless individuals find meaning and connection in a cultural context that provides little support for inner life. The tension between Jung and Edinger on this point mirrors a larger tension in how we think about psychological knowledge. Is it esoteric wisdom, necessarily rare and difficult, accessible only to those willing to undertake an intensive initiatory process? Or is it practical knowledge that can and should be widely shared, made accessible to as many people as possible? Spiritual and psychological traditions have always struggled with this question. Mystery religions preserved their teachings for initiates who had undergone proper preparation. Exoteric religions offered more accessible teachings to everyone, but often in simplified forms that lost the depth of the original insight. The same pattern appears in psychology. The deep work happens in intensive analysis with a skilled practitioner, but how much can be conveyed through books, lectures, workshops? Jung leaned toward the esoteric model. He felt that real psychological transformation required direct encounter with the unconscious, which typically only happened through the intensified relationship of analysis. Books could point toward this experience but couldn't substitute for it. He was content to write for the relatively few who were ready to hear him, who felt the call to individuation. Edinger leaned toward wider accessibility without completely abandoning the esoteric core. His books were clearer and more accessible than Jung's, but he still insisted that reading about the psyche wasn't enough. One had to do the inner work, engage with one's own dreams and active imagination, preferably in the context of analysis. The framework could be taught widely, but the experience had to be lived individually. This balanced approach may be the most sustainable for depth psychology going forward. Completely esoteric traditions tend to die out, unable to replenish their membership. Completely exoteric presentations often lose the transformative power of the original insight. The art is in maintaining both levels. Clear, accessible presentations that invite people in, and deep transformative practices for those who are called to go further. As we continue our nighttime exploration of these two great psychological minds, let us turn to another dimension of their work, how they each understood and worked with religious symbolism, particularly Christian symbolism. Both Jung and Edinger devoted enormous attention to religious texts and images, but their approaches reflected their different temperaments and goals. Jung's relationship with Christian symbolism was complex and ambivalent. On one hand, he recognized Christianity as the dominant symbolic system of Western culture, the matrix out of which Western consciousness had developed. He explored Christian symbols extensively: the Trinity, the Incarnation, the crucifixion and resurrection, the Virgin Mary, Christ as the self-symbol, Satan as shadow. Jung saw Christianity as containing profound psychological truths expressed in symbolic form. The Incarnation, God becoming human in Christ, symbolized the self entering into ego consciousness, the divine becoming embodied in individual life. The crucifixion represented the necessary suffering and sacrifice of the ego in service of wholeness. The resurrection symbolized renewal and transformation, the emergence of new consciousness after death and descent. But Jung also sharply criticized Christianity for what he saw as its incompleteness and one-sidedness. Christianity had split reality into irreconcilable opposites: good and evil, spirit and matter, masculine and feminine, this world and the next. It had projected evil entirely onto Satan rather than recognizing shadow as an integral part of the divine. It had suppressed the feminine, acknowledging Mary only reluctantly and never as equal to the masculine trinity. It had rejected matter and the body as inferior to spirit. These problems in Christianity, Jung argued, had psychological consequences. By refusing to integrate evil and the shadow, Christianity had created enormous unconscious darkness that eventually erupted in the horrors of the 20th century. By suppressing the feminine, it had damaged the psyches of both men and women. By rejecting matter and the body, it had contributed to the split between spirit and nature that characterized modern consciousness. Jung was particularly harsh on Christianity's purely positive God image. He argued that the psychological reality was more complex. The self contains both light and dark, creative and destructive aspects. The old Gnostic vision of a God who contained both good and evil, or even a dark aspect alongside the light, was psychologically truer than Christianity's all-good God, opposed to a separate evil, Satan. This critique reached its height in Jung's late work, Answer to Job, where he argued that the biblical Job story revealed an unconscious, amoral dimension in the God image that Christianity had never adequately addressed. Job was more moral than the God who tormented him, suggesting that human consciousness had evolved to become more ethical than the divine image it worshipped. This required a transformation in the God image itself, which Jung saw beginning in the Christian incarnation but not yet complete. These provocative ideas made many Christians deeply uncomfortable. They seemed to reduce God to a psychological projection, to psychoanalyze divinity itself. Traditional Christians saw this as blasphemous. Even liberal Christians often found it difficult. Who was Jung to criticize God or to suggest that the divine image needed psychological development? Jung always maintained that he was speaking psychologically, not theologically. He wasn't making claims about whether God objectively existed or what God's nature was in itself. He was describing how the God image functioned in the human psyche, what psychological needs it met, and what problems it created. But this distinction was often too subtle for readers, and many felt that Jung's psychological analysis undermined religious faith. Edinger approached Christian symbolism with more reverence and less criticism. He saw Christianity as containing essential psychological and spiritual truths that needed to be reinterpreted for modern consciousness but not fundamentally challenged. His books on Christian themes, The Christian Archetype, Transformation of the God Image, Archetype of the Apocalypse, presented Christian symbols as valid expressions of individuation process and ego-self relationship. Where Jung emphasized Christianity's problems and incompleteness, Edinger emphasized its psychological wisdom. The story of Christ was the archetypal story of the self incarnating in human form, suffering, dying to the old, and being reborn. It was the pattern of individuation, presented in narrative form, accessible to anyone in Christian culture. The crucifixion was particularly important for Edinger as a symbol of the ego's necessary suffering in service of the self. The ego, like Christ, must accept the burden of consciousness, must bear the tension of the opposites, must sacrifice its own will in service of something greater. This crucifixion of the ego was painful but necessary for psychological growth. Edinger also explored the Book of Revelation extensively, seeing it as a symbolic description of the transformation of consciousness occurring in Western culture. The apocalyptic images, the beast, the whore of Babylon, the New Jerusalem, represented psychological realities, the dark side erupting into consciousness, the old ego structure dissolving, the emergence of new wholeness. These interpretations made Christian symbolism psychologically accessible and valuable for modern people who could no longer believe the literal doctrines, but who still found the images and stories compelling. Edinger showed that you didn't have to believe in a literal second coming to find meaning in Revelation. You could read it as a description of psychological transformation that individuals and cultures undergo. This approach was less threatening to religious faith than Jung's had been. Edinger wasn't criticizing Christianity or claiming it was incomplete. He was translating its symbols into psychological language and showing their 14 continuing relevance. Many religious readers appreciated this, seeing it as a way to maintain connection with their tradition while acknowledging modern consciousness's inability to accept literal, supernatural claims. But Edinger's more respectful approach also had limitations. By emphasizing the positive wisdom in Christian symbols, he sometimes glossed over the genuine problems Jung had identified. Christianity really had projected evil entirely outside, rather than integrating shadow. It really had suppressed feminine divinity. It really had promoted otherworldly focus at the expense of embodied life. Edinger acknowledged these issues, but didn't emphasize them as much as Jung had. The difference between Jung and Edinger on Christianity reflects their different relationships to tradition more broadly. Jung was a revolutionary, willing to challenge and critique the dominant tradition even when it made people uncomfortable. He felt that Christianity in its traditional form was dying, and that trying to preserve it was futile. What mattered was extracting the psychological essence and translating it into forms that could work for modern consciousness. Edinger was more conservative in the literal sense, more interested in conserving and adapting the tradition than in revolutionary critique. He believed that Western people needed continuity with their religious roots, that completely abandoning Christianity would be psychologically damaging, even if the old literal beliefs no longer worked. His approach allowed people to maintain connection with Christian symbols while reinterpreting them psychologically. Both approaches have value for different people. Some need the revolutionary critique, need permission to let go of religious forms that no longer serve them. Others need the adaptive reinterpretation, need help finding continued meaning in their tradition. The question is not which approach is right, but which serves the individual's psychological needs at their particular stage of development. In the larger picture, Jung and Edinger together represent the process by which Western culture is working through its relationship with Christianity. Jung represents the necessary critique and differentiation, the recognition of what's problematic in the tradition. Edinger represents the preservation and reinterpretation, the recognition of what remains valuable. Both movements are necessary for a tradition to transform rather than simply dying or ossifying. This process is still ongoing in Western culture. We see some people completely abandoning religious tradition, seeking meaning elsewhere or doing without. We see others clinging to literal traditional belief, refusing to acknowledge modern consciousness's questions. And we see many in the middle, trying to find ways to maintain connection with symbolic tradition while living honestly with modern awareness. Jung and Edinger together provide resources for this middle path. As the night deepens, and we drift further into our meditation on these two minds, let us consider one final dimension of their work, how they each understood the analyst's role and the nature of psychological authority. This is a subtle but important area of difference that reveals different visions of how psychological knowledge is held and transmitted. Jung was famously anti-authoritarian in his approach to analysis. He resisted being seen as a guru or master, insisted that patients not blindly follow his interpretations, and emphasized that each person must find their own way. He told patients when he didn't know what their dreams meant, admitted his own confusion, and encouraged them to trust their own inner guidance more than his expertise. This anti-authoritarian stance reflected Jung's understanding that the real authority in analysis is the unconscious itself, the self. The analyst is not the one who knows and directs. Rather, the analyst is a companion on a journey where neither party fully knows the way. Both analyst and patient are subordinate to the guidance coming from the unconscious, from dreams and synchronicities and inner promptings. Jung also emphasized the necessity of the analyst remaining in their own process, working with their own dreams and inner material. The analyst who imagines they've completed their own individuation, who positions themselves as fully conscious and whole, is inflated and dangerous. True psychological wisdom includes awareness of one's own ongoing unconsciousness, one's own shadow, one's own need for continued growth. This meant that Jungian analysis, as Jung practiced it, was fundamentally egalitarian, despite the asymmetry of the therapeutic relationship. The analyst had certain knowledge and skills, certainly, but was not fundamentally different from or superior to the patient. Both were struggling humans trying to become more conscious, with the analyst simply a bit further along the path. Edinger maintained this basic, egalitarian stance, but also introduced more structure around the analyst's role and authority. He spoke of the analyst as one who has developed more conscious relationship to the self, and who can therefore help others do the same. The analyst's training and experience gave them certain expertise that the patient typically lacked. Edinger used the metaphor of the analyst as a midwife, helping birth new consciousness in the patient. The midwife doesn't create the baby, but has knowledge and skills that facilitate the birth process. Similarly, the analyst doesn't create the patient's individuation, but knows how to recognize and support the process that the self is initiating. This gave the analyst somewhat more authority and active guidance than in Jung's more hands-off approach. Edinger believed the analyst should actively interpret dreams in light of the ego. Self-framework should identify what developmental stage the patient was in, should offer guidance about what work needed to happen. This was not authoritarian imposition, but rather informed facilitation. The difference here is subtle but significant. Jung's approach maximized patient autonomy, but risked leaving patients confused, not knowing how to proceed. Edinger's approach provided more guidance and structure, but risked the analyst imposing their framework rather than truly listening to what the patient's unique process required. Again, both approaches have their place. Some patients need more guidance, others need more space to find their own way. Some analysts have the gift of sitting with not knowing. Others serve better by offering informed perspective. The art is in sensing what the particular therapeutic relationship needs. Edinger was also more explicit than Jung about the spiritual dimension of the analyst's role. He spoke of analysis as a sacred profession, of the analyst as holding space for the numinous, as being in service to the self's purposes. This gave the work a devotional quality that went beyond technique or clinical skill. Jung certainly would have agreed with this spiritual dimension, but he was more reluctant to speak of it explicitly, wary of inflation and of positioning analysis as a new priesthood. Edinger, less worried about these dangers, openly embraced the spiritual nature of analytical work. This reflects their different historical moments. Jung was establishing a new field, differentiating from both religion and medical psychiatry, and had to be careful about how he positioned his work. Edinger, working decades later, when Jungian analysis was more established, had more freedom to emphasize its spiritual dimensions without fear of the work being dismissed as merely religious. In the final analysis, The differences between Jung and Edinger are differences of emphasis and expression rather than fundamental disagreement. They were working on the same project, helping modern people recover connection to meaning and the sacred through psychological 16 work. They both understood that symptoms are symbolic, that the unconscious is intelligent and purposive, that the ego, self-relationship, is central to psychological health, that individuation is the goal of human development. Jung articulated this vision in its original, radical, often paradoxical form, drawing directly from his own overwhelming encounters with the unconscious. Edinger systematized and clarified this vision, making it more teachable and clinically applicable while maintaining reverence for its spiritual core. Neither could have done the other's work. Both were necessary. As we drift toward the completion of our nighttime meditation, let us reflect on what the dialogue between Jung and Edinger reveals about the nature of psychological understanding itself. Their relationship illustrates a pattern that appears throughout intellectual history. The visionary founder who has the original insight and the devoted student who systematizes and transmits it. This pattern is neither good nor bad. It's simply how human knowledge develops and spreads. Great insights typically come first in inchoate, difficult, paradoxical forms to individuals who have direct experience of whatever they're describing. These insights then need translation and organization to become widely accessible. The translator inevitably changes something in the process, emphasizes some aspects over others, clarifies some things while perhaps obscuring others. In the best cases, like Jung and Edinger, the translator remains faithful to the core vision while making necessary adaptations. They don't distort or betray, but rather develop and apply. They stand in proper relationship to the source, honoring it, while also claiming their own legitimate authority to extend and modify. This process is itself an image of the ego, self-relationship. The self is the source, the wellspring of insight and meaning. The ego receives from the self and then has the task of articulating, organizing, applying what it has received. The ego doesn't create, but rather translates what the self reveals. Good translation is creative in its own right, but it always remains in service to the source. Jung was a particularly powerful channel for the self, able to access and articulate profound psychological truths. But even Jung's ego had to work to express what he experienced, had to find language and concepts and frameworks. His work was already a translation of numinous experience into comprehensible form. Edinger worked at one further remove, translating Jung's translation, making the second degree of organization necessary for wide transmission. This is not a lesser work, but rather a different one, equally necessary for the tradition to survive and flourish. We can see this same pattern in other traditions. The Buddha had direct realization. Nagarjuna systematized Buddhist philosophy. Jesus embodied the Christ principle. Paul created Christian theology. The pattern repeats because it's necessary. The visionary and the systematizer are both essential roles in how wisdom transmits across generations. What matters is that both roles are done with integrity, that the systematizer doesn't betray the vision in the process of organizing it, and that followers of the tradition don't mistake the systematized version for the original experience. Maps are useful, but they're not the territory. Frameworks help us orient, but they're not the reality they describe. Jung and Edinger together invite us into a both-and relationship with psychological knowledge. We can appreciate Jung's original vision in all its mystery and paradox. We can read his difficult texts and let them work on us at multiple levels. And we can also appreciate Edinger's clear frameworks and developmental schemas, can use them practically to understand our own processes and guide our own journeys. We don't have to choose between them. In fact, moving between their different approaches can be enriching. Reading Jung keeps us open, uncertain, aware of the irreducible mystery of the psyche. Reading Edinger helps us make sense of our experiences, gives us language and concepts to work with. Both are valuable, both have their place. The real insight is that psychological truth is not one-dimensional. It exists simultaneously at multiple levels, from the most abstract theoretical to the most concrete experiential. We need language at all these levels, need thinkers who work at different registers. Jung and Edinger together provide a fuller picture than either could alone. In our own psychological work, whether as therapists or as individuals seeking our own development, we can learn from both men. We can adopt Jung's attitude of openness and humility before the unconscious, his willingness to not know, his emphasis on letting symbols and images work on us rather than rushing to interpret them. And we can also use Edinger's frameworks to understand where we are developmentally, to recognize patterns in our experiences, to make sense of our symptoms and dreams. The both-and approach is itself deeply Jungian. Jung always emphasized the union of opposites, the transcendent function that emerges when we hold tensions rather than resolving them prematurely. The tension between mystery and understanding, between experience and concept, between the numinous and the practical, this is a creative tension that generates new insight when we hold it consciously. Perhaps what Jung and Edinger together are teaching us is that depth psychology is both a science and an art, both a discipline and a spiritual practice, both a clinical methodology and a path of initiation. It's all of these things simultaneously, and impoverishing it by reducing it to only one dimension misses its full richness. In this sense, the conversation between Jung and Edinger continues in each of us who engages with their work. We're not passive recipients of a fixed body of knowledge, but active, participants in an ongoing dialogue about the nature of the psyche, consciousness, and human meaning. Each generation must work out for itself how to understand and apply these insights in its own cultural context. The modern world Jung and Edinger knew has changed in some ways, remained the same in others. We face new technologies, new social arrangements, new global challenges, but the fundamental human questions they addressed remain. How do I find meaning in my life? How do I relate to something greater than my personal ego? How do I integrate my light and shadow into wholeness? How do I understand my suffering? How do I discover my unique purpose? These timeless questions ensure that Jung's and Edinger's work remains relevant even as specific cultural forms change. The ego, self-relationship is not a concept tied to a particular historical moment, but rather a permanent structure of the psyche that every generation must discover and work with in its own way. As we rest in the stillness of this late hour, as we feel ourselves drifting between waking and sleeping, between thought and dream, we can appreciate how the dialogue between Jung and Edinger has enriched our understanding of this mysterious territory between consciousness and the unconscious. Their conversation across the decades has illuminated the landscape of the soul, providing both maps and inspiration for our own inner journeys. Jung showed us that the psyche contains depths beyond imagining, that we are far more than we think we are, that consciousness floats on an ocean of unconscious life. He revealed the archetypal patterns that structure human experience across cultures and history. He demonstrated that symptoms are meaningful, that dreams speak wisdom, that life itself is a symbolic process when we learn to read its language. Edinger took these revelations and organized them into frameworks we could use, developmental patterns we could recognize, clinical methods we could apply. He showed how to build and repair the bridge between ego and self, how to read the symbolic language Jung had discovered, how to guide ourselves and others through the stages of consciousness development. Together, they created a psychology that honors both the scientific demand for clarity and the spiritual hunger for transcendence. They built bridges between the consulting room and the temple, between clinical observation and mystical experience, between the personal and the archetypal. Their work continues through those of us who engage with it, who apply it in our own lives and with our own patients or students. The tradition is alive to the extent that each generation doesn't just repeat, but rather creatively extends what came before, finding new applications and expressions while remaining true to the core insights. In the quiet of this night, we can feel gratitude for both these men and for the gift they gave us, a way of understanding human experience that restores meaning, that recognizes the sacred dimension of ordinary life, that provides both comfort and challenge. Their psychology asks us to take ourselves seriously as spiritual beings on a journey of becoming, to honor our symptoms as teachers, to trust that our lives are guided by intelligence greater than ego consciousness can comprehend. This is the true gift of depth psychology, not a complete explanation of the psyche, which would be impossible, but rather an invitation into relationship with the mystery, tools for the journey, encouragement that the struggle is worthwhile. Jung and Edinger, each in their own way, extended this invitation and provided these tools. As we let ourselves drift fully now towards sleep, we can hold in awareness the great gift of this psychological tradition, this lineage of those who have explored the depths and returned with reports. We're not alone in our confusion and searching. Others have walked this path before us, have mapped the territory, have left markers and guideposts. Yet we must each walk it ourselves, must have our own encounters with the unconscious, must discover in our own experience what Jung and Edinger described in their theories. No one can do this for us. No book or teacher can substitute for the actual journey, but their work can guide us, can help us recognize what we're experiencing, can assure us that the difficult passages are necessary and meaningful. The conversation between Jung and Edinger reminds us that psychological understanding develops through dialogue, through the creative tension between different approaches and emphases. We need not choose one right way, but rather can draw on multiple perspectives, can use different tools for different tasks, can appreciate how apparent contradictions often point toward deeper truths. In the end, both Jung and Edinger were in service to something greater than themselves, something they called the self, but which has been given many names throughout human history: the divine spark, the Buddha nature, the Atman, the Imago Dei. This something exists at the center of each person, connecting individual consciousness to universal consciousness, making possible the journey of individuation through which we become who we truly are. Their shared commitment was to helping people discover and serve this inner divine center, to facilitating the development of conscious relationship between ego and self, to restoring meaning in a world that had lost its soul. This commitment animated all their work, giving it depth and purpose beyond merely clinical effectiveness. As we settle into sleep now, we can carry with us the understanding that we too participate in this great work, that our own struggles and questionings and dreams are part of the larger human project of consciousness development. We're not just isolated individuals with private psychological problems. We're participants in the ongoing evolution of human awareness. However modest our particular first contribution might be, this larger perspective can be comforting in difficult times. When we're struggling with depression or anxiety or meaninglessness, when we feel lost and confused, we can remember that these experiences are not mere pathology, but rather the growing pains of consciousness itself. The self is working in us, through our very struggles, to bring about new development, new wholeness. This is what Jung discovered in his own descent into the unconscious and what he tried to articulate throughout his life. This is what Edinger clarified and systematized, making it more accessible to those of us who came later. And this is what we're invited to discover for ourselves as we engage in our own psychological and spiritual work. The night grows late, and our exploration draws to its natural close. We've wandered through the parallel and intersecting paths of two great minds, two devoted explorers of the psyche's vast territories. We've seen how they converged and diverged, how they complemented and enriched each other, how together they provide fuller understanding than either could alone. Let these insights settle gently into your consciousness now as you drift towards sleep. Let the understanding that your life has meaning, that your struggles are purposeful, that you're guided by wisdom deeper than ego consciousness, bring comfort and peace. Jung and Edinger, different as they were, both affirmed this essential truth, that human life participates in something sacred, and that psychological work is ultimately spiritual work, the opus of the soul. May their combined wisdom guide your dreams tonight, illuminating the symbolic landscape of your inner world. May you wake with renewed sense of connection to the self, to the divine center that guides your journey. And may you continue to explore with curiosity and courage the infinite depths of consciousness that these two great psychologists mapped for us all. Rest now, wanderer, in the knowing that you are held by something greater than yourself, guided by an intelligence that speaks through dreams and symbols, symptoms and synchronicities. Your life is meaningful, your journey purposeful, your struggles necessary steps toward wholeness. This is the gift Jung discovered and Edinger clarified, and it is offered now to you as you drift into the healing darkness of sleep.